In the early days of March 1953, while the rest of the world anxiously awaited news from the Soviet Union, an American ambassador sarcastically wrote, "Uncle Joe is sick in bed. The blood runs fast in his head. If he can't walk and he can't talk, by whom now are the communists led?" The mood was much more serious in Moscow, as Joseph Stalin, absolute dictator of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, for nearly 30 years, was dying. While his doctors desperately tried to treat his symptoms, his subordinates scrambled for position in the subsequent power vacuum. On March 5th, Stalin's final battle was over, and the dictator finally lay dead. The USSR officially declared that his cause of death was a hemorrhagic stroke. However, recent evidence has come to light casting doubt on this, with some researchers maintaining the possibility that Stalin was actually poisoned, likely with warfarin or a similar anticoagulant drug. His sudden death from a supposed stroke shocked the world and triggered a frenzied power struggle within the ranks of the Soviet government. In this video, we will examine the available evidence to determine whether Stalin's stroke was natural or artificially induced. Stalins Health. As some of the most talented doctors in the USSR were being tortured to confess their complicity with foreign intelligence services, Stalin continued to display the relentless insistence on total control at all times that had defined him since childhood in nearly every aspect of his life, from political domination to the meticulous planning of the exact details of his private dacha on the outskirts of Moscow, where he would eventually die. Curiously, he never applied this same attitude to his health. Throughout his life, Stalin had a notable penchant for immobility, barely engaging in any kind of exercise. Even going out for a walk in his later years was out of the question. Although his exile in Siberia by the Tsarist government when he was young had forced him to learn hunting out of necessity, he abandoned the activity as soon as he could. He consistently showed no interest in sports or any physical activity more strenuous than billiards, smoked excessively until reluctantly stopping in 1952, overate rich foods with an emphasis on meat dishes, and overworked himself. Stalin's insomniac habit of total dedication to work was expected of all party members, to the point that a government report from 1947 found that many senior officials in the USSR administration were suffering from diseases of the heart, circulatory system, and nervous system severe enough to impact their ability to work. One cause of this is stressful work, not just during the day, but also at night, and often even on holidays. Alcohol was the only substance he practiced in moderation throughout his life, preferring to sip a light Georgian wine while forcing his guests to drink excessively. There is no archival evidence that Stalin was under the care of any physician after January 1952, except for a brief visit to an ENT doctor in April. In the final months of his life, his only form of health care was a few drops of iodine poured into a glass of water to treat his hypertension. One of his main medical advisors was a bodyguard who had previously received some training as a veterinarian. Even his daughter Svetlana was surprised by the quack treatments her father was receiving when she visited. By March 3rd, doctors announced that death is inevitable. The Soviet government released an official statement on Stalin's health the next morning, admitting that the serious illness of Comrade Stalin will entail his more or less prolonged absence from leadership activity. As the world absorbed the shocking news, it became increasingly clear that the dictator was on his deathbed. A top-secret CIA report on Stalin's death, declassified in June 2007, concluded that the USSR government was being extraordinarily careful to avoid any implication that Stalin's care was being sabotaged by a doctor-destroyer. On March 5th, Stalin's health took a turn for the worse. He vomited blood on 2 occasions, significantly reducing both his blood pressure and his pulse. This sudden development caught the doctors by surprise and aroused the suspicion of Nikolai Bulganin, who was present at the time. He demanded an explanation and was given the theory that Stalin had developed small hemorrhages in the stomach wall. Bulganin was not convinced and ironically asked, "Is that possible? Perhaps Stalin has stomach cancer?" With his last breath, Stalin suddenly opened his eyes and cast a terrible, insane, or perhaps angry and fearful look of death across the room, raising his left hand in a strange gesture as if casting a curse. The gesture was incomprehensible and full of menace, and no one could say to whom or to what it might have been directed. Seconds later, he expired at 9:50 p.m. on March 5th. To Nikita Khrushchev's horror, one of the assistants ran to the bed and began giving Stalin artificial respiration, massaging him to make him breathe again. This is unsurprising, as doctors in totalitarian states fear imminent dead patients. The man was quickly stopped, and the room fell into deep silence, contemplating the pitiful and poor corpse that lay before them. The subsequent autopsy was published in the March 7th edition of Pravda and revealed extensive bleeding in the subcortical areas of Stalin's left cerebral hemisphere, as well as significant hypertrophy of the left ventricle, numerous hemorrhages in the myocardium, stomach, and intestines, and significant atherosclerotic changes throughout his vascular system. Pravda concluded that all treatment attempts could not have led to a favorable outcome and avoid a fatal end. The description of Stalin's brain suggests that he possibly suffered a series of lacunar infarcts consistent with his reported history of strokes and secondary to his atherosclerosis. Just like Lenin before him, Stalin's brain was removed and sent to the Brain Institute in Moscow for study. The autopsy report in Pravda was brief and did not describe the neuropathology of Stalin's brain in significant detail. The final report presented to the Central Committee of the USSR officially stated that Stalin died due to a hemorrhagic stroke caused by high blood pressure. Due to the delays in treating the dying dictator, there is considerable speculation that Stalin's potential successors seized the opportunity presented by his stroke to eliminate the paranoid leader. Or perhaps his death was even caused by poisoning during the previous night of drinking. Each of Joseph Stalin's closest associates present that night had their own complex motivations and personal histories with the Soviet leader. Vyacheslav Molotov, a prominent member of Stalin's inner circle, had a particularly personal grievance. 5 years before Stalin's death, Molotov's Jewish wife, Polina, had been arrested under accusations of treason, accused of having ties to Zionist organizations. She was subsequently imprisoned and exiled. Molotov, unable to communicate with her due to Stalin's interference, is said to have had 2 meals served every night, as a poignant reminder of her absence, later expressing sadness and guilt over her suffering. Lavrenti Beria, Georgy Malenkov, and Nikita Khrushchev, though not driven by such intimate grievances as Molotov, were deeply aware of Stalin's declining health and the power vacuum his death would create. Each harbored ambitions to succeed Stalin and recognized the danger they faced due to Stalin's notorious and unpredictable paranoia. Their influential positions within the Soviet hierarchy were perpetually at risk while Stalin was alive, providing a potential motive to hasten his end. Beria, in particular, is often considered to have had the most to gain from Stalin's death. Rumors suggest he had fallen out of favor with Stalin, possibly fueling resentment and a desire for revenge. Notably, Beria made no effort to conceal his satisfaction with the course of events and, according to Molotov's memoirs, even boasted to the Politburo that he had eliminated Stalin and saved us all. The conjecture that Stalin was murdered, possibly by Beria or his associates, remains a topic of debate and speculation. An autopsy was performed on Stalin's body, revealing a large hemorrhage in the left cerebral hemisphere and other significant health issues, including left ventricular hypertrophy and atherosclerotic changes in the cerebral arteries. These findings were consistent with extracranial changes often observed in stroke victims, contradicting the theories of deliberate poisoning that have been speculated over the years. However, it should be noted that this autopsy was conducted in the Soviet Union, hardly a bastion of free expression or transparency. Thus, while there is no concrete physical evidence to conclusively prove the poisoning theory, it is not beyond the bounds of historical speculation. What is clear is that Stalin's oppressive regime and his brutal treatment of those around him, including his own inner circle, fostered an atmosphere of fear and betrayal that contributed to his downfall. In an incident illustrating Stalin's growing distrust and suspicion, he had a doctor arrested and imprisoned under accusations of being a British intelligence spy nearly a year before his death. This came after the doctor advised Stalin to retire to reduce the stress that was impacting his health. Now let's return to the poisoning hypothesis. Here we have something quite interesting. Although Beria likely could have secured access to warfarin and had a history of using poisons to eliminate enemies, it seems highly unlikely that Stalin was poisoned with it, or a similar anticoagulant. The first refutation of this theory can be found in Stalin himself. As his paranoia grew, he became obsessive about the possibility of being poisoned. He made his personal chef a general and had his food grown and processed at special food farms and factories. By the end of his life, his paranoia had grown to the point that he regularly insisted on having his food tested in a retinue of laboratories and rats that accompanied him everywhere. Although there is no confirmation that this collection of animals was present at the dacha on the night of February 28th to March 1st, Stalin routinely encouraged his guests to drink heavily while he himself maintained relative sobriety. According to one account, that night he only had light drinks. Even if Khrushchev's account is correct, and Stalin was a little dizzy that night, it is difficult to imagine a scenario in which Beria or another conspirator could have slipped an anticoagulant into his drink. As Stalin himself said in 1951, "I don't trust anyone, not even myself." He would never have given any of his guests, some of whom were under suspicion at the time, such an opportunity. The second refutation is that warfarin is not a particularly effective poison, at least in terms of assassination. By 1951, it was already established that vitamin K could be used to neutralize the effects of an acute warfarin overdose. With such a widely available antidote, it would have been reckless for Beria or others to use warfarin as a poison. Furthermore, while warfarin overdoses can be associated with acute gastrointestinal bleeding, it is extraordinarily unlikely that Stalin would not have presented with other symptoms of an acute coagulopathy. In 1954, the United States Armed Forces Medical Journal reported the case of a Korean family of 14 people who accidentally consumed corn bait mixed with warfarin-based rat poison. The primary symptoms were bruising and mucosal bleeding. In a 1992 case report, researchers described a 25-year-old man who attempted suicide by consuming 4 boxes of rat poison containing brodifacoum, a vitamin K antagonist anticoagulant similar to warfarin in its mechanism of action. The patient presented with syncope, hematemesis, hematuria, and epistaxis. He eventually died of subarachnoid hemorrhage several weeks later, after returning to the emergency room following additional brodifacoum ingestion. Aside from his 2 episodes of hematemesis, Stalin did not present any unusual bleeding that would raise suspicion of an underlying coagulopathy. It also appears that even if Stalin had been poisoned with warfarin, it would have taken longer than 24 to 48 hours for any symptoms to manifest. In the 1954 warfarin overdose case discussed above, the family continued consuming the warfarin-laced bait for several days before showing any symptoms, with one of the children consuming the bait for 15 days before dying of a severe nosebleed on the 17th day. Similarly, in the 1992 case report discussed above, The patient who overdosed on brodifacoum managed to delay going to the emergency room for up to 9 days, even though this compound is 200 times more toxic than warfarin and has a half-life that is 60 times longer. Taking this into account, along with the enormous quantities of anticoagulant consumed in both cases, the timeline for the alleged poisoning of Stalin does not align with his stroke. Even in the 1951 case, the first recorded poisoning of a human with warfarin, the U.S. Army recruit reported consuming warfarin for 6 consecutive days, ingesting approximately 113-gram card of warfarin-based rat poison during that time. He had no symptoms until 2 days after his last dose, when he began experiencing constipation, epistaxis, back pain, abdominal pain, vomiting, and a petechial rash. Interestingly, he reported having learned about the compound from a recent issue of a popular magazine, supporting our earlier hypothesis that this rodenticide was known at the time and would not have been beyond Beria's reach to obtain. However, this prolonged course of illness further emphasizes that Stalin's symptoms and the course of his disease do not correlate with intentional warfarin poisoning. Based on the evidence currently available to us, it is almost certain that Stalin, a paranoid, inactive, and generally unhealthy man in his mid-70s who routinely imprisoned and executed his own doctors, with a long history of untreated chronic hypertension, died exactly the way the Soviet government declared, of a hemorrhagic stroke in the left MCA, secondary to his hypertension. Ultimately, it seems that Joseph Broz Tito, dictator of the communist regime in Yugoslavia, was correct in his pronouncement on Stalin's death. Nature is allied with justice. Thank you very much for your audience. May God bless you all. A big hug, and see you soon.